Hey everyone, it's Cam here, welcoming you to another episode of The Build Room. Now we've got a massive episode for you today, which is a follow-on from last week where we chopped a huge amount of metal out of the back of Violet Crumbles. So this week's episode is going to be about putting all that metal back in to make this rusty hunk whole again. So stick around and check it out. So yeah, first of all, this is a second part episode. So if you haven't watched the first part, make sure you go back and watch that. I'll put a link to it here. In that episode, we took on the passenger side dogleg area on Violet Crumbles. Now that turned out to be a lot worse than I expected. It was basically a tetanus flavored layer cake. So there was 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of pain there. Wasn't that fun for everyone? But we did get all of the rusty metal out of that area, and I got the first new piece of good sheet metal back in and all welded up tight. And it already feels like it's got a bit more structure to it. So today we're gonna try and build up those other outer layers. So if we look at the parts that I've got on the bench at the moment, so what I've done here is I've put these basically in the order of their layering on the car. So this is the outer layer, this was the wheel arch piece, and this was the actual dogleg area. This was the next layer below it that we saw as we pulled this layer off. And these bits here, there's not much left of them, but they actually make up that piece of bracing that was just screwed in from the top. Now, that obviously has a lot more metal on it, and I believe it joins up to this. I'm not 100% sure, but certainly in terms of the layering, we've got 3 layers there, 1, 2, and 3. Now, this is a bit counterintuitive, but I'm not gonna start building out this layer first. And that's because what I need is for this layer to fit neatly underneath this layer. So this is an area of bracing that sits inside cocooned in this. And if I was to build this out and have some of the areas protrude too much, I wouldn't be able to fit this back on. And unfortunately, there's not enough of this sheet metal left to adequately mock it up. So this piece I can use to mock up the size of this because there's still the basic body there. This piece, on the other hand, is so eaten out that I'm never gonna be able to tell how that went together. So I'm gonna build this one up first. We'll get that in place, but we won't weld it on, obviously. And then we'll build this up and make sure we can lay this over it neatly. And once we've got those two fixed up, then it's onto the main piece. Now, accuracy, warping, and neat welds are not so important on these 2 layers, but I'm really gonna have to lift my game when we start on this one. So I'll spend a lot more time fabricating here. These will be sort of rough and ready as long as they're structurally sound. And the other thing that I've got to check out is how much of the original sheet metal is actually salvageable. I'm not trying to do this to save on metal costs or save on effort, because it's probably going to be more effort to do it this way, but some of these complex shapes are there for a reason. These actually keep the 2 metal panels, so the outer fender wraps around it, from touching all the way, so that there's a bit of an area for drainage and things like that, because no matter what you're doing on these cars, you're going to get water that goes in behind the window felts and all that sort of thing. So there's no way you can really keep dust and dirt and water out of these permanently. So you've got to make sure you don't compromise the original draining mechanisms when you do your repair. So to keep things interesting, the plan is going to be to take on these small pieces of sheet metal that I've already cut out of the car, get them all cleaned up, then rebuild the inner layers on that dogleg area. And then we're going to take a really good look down that driver's side sill and see what the rust situation's there like, cut out any more metal if we need to. Then we'll circle back around and we'll get everything put back together. And then once that rail section's complete, then we can actually weld in the pieces that we'll build out into that dogleg section, and then we can finish the final outside layer, and then it should be job done. So let's crack on. right, so we've got the penultimate skin here, the second to last. That came up pretty good. The main thing that I've really been concerned with is making sure that this inside is smooth so that when it does need to drain water, it's going to be able to do that pretty easily. And I think we've been successful there. I did forget to cover up a couple little bits that I'm going to weld on, so I will need to strip these ends back, give them another coat of copper primer, and also around this point here where we're going to spot weld, and this point here as well. And as for the bracing piece, that's done as well. You can see that there's copper bits that are still exposed where all the spot welds are going to happen. The rest is coated in that high temp black ceramic caliper paint. So it should be all nice and protected when it goes back in. But before we can do that, we've got to check out that sill. Okay, so as I said before, this area of the sill all looks pretty good. It's really only this area down here that's questionable. Now, all of the holes that would have been in here for that piece of body molding have been filled, and by the looks of that other piece, they were just bogged up. So I'm expecting a little bit of rust around those, but nothing that would really warrant me pulling this entire thing off. So let's see if we can get the camera down here and figure out what sort of situation we've got. All right, that looks really, really impressive. You can see there's a little bit of rust down the end where I thought there would be. But down the length of the sill, it looks pretty good. I'm definitely not going to waste my time cutting that off. But what I am going to do is strip all of this back to bare metal. We'll make sure there's no rust worms or anything like that in it. Now in this area, my plan is to take out the spot welds along here, and then I'll probably just section this straight through here. The reason being is I don't want to start drilling out all these spot welds, and you know, it's a layer upon layer situation that I'm never going to see the end of. And I also don't think there's any significant chance of having major rust up this high. So all I want to do is make sure that the line that I weld in on when I'm done to weld this piece back in is high enough not to get wet, because there will be a seam there obviously. And then around the spot welds and everything, I just want to make sure that it's nice and neatly removed so that when I put it back in, we don't have rust problems that come through there. So yeah, let's get this section out and the sill stripped and then see where we are.
I don't know, don't know. I don't know, don't know. I don't know, don't know. I don't know.
All right, so that is nothing but wind. Those sills are awesome. Managed to get all the pinch weld pretty straight. There's no rust in the underside. This is all absolutely perfect sheet metal here. I was expecting a little bits of rust here and there like we saw on the other side, but nothing. As far as I'm concerned, that is fantastic, and we can keep on trucking along.
I don't know. Don't know. I don't know. Don't know. I don't know. Don't know.
Okay, so the Sill Prep is done. Really happy with how it came out. This end piece I sandblasted back, we copper primed it, put some of the ceramic paint on the inside of it. That's really, really thick, so it should be really nicely protected. I did have to weld up a few little spots, but it's all good as far as I'm concerned, ready to weld back in. And if you were paying attention in the montage, you would have seen a weird apparatus fogging paint down the sill. Now what I actually did there was I had a can of cavity wax. This is just CR cavity wax. And what this stuff's really good for is coating the inside of hard to reach places so that they don't get affected by water ingress or moisture buildup. But one of the other things that this one in particular has is a special nozzle that lets you get into those hard to reach spaces. And what it is basically a special cap with a brass end to it and then a plastic hose, and the plastic runs out to another brass fitting, and this has a number of holes that have been drilled into it. So you can see what's going to happen here. When you put that cap on and you send the wax through, it goes all the way down the line and out the ends, and it sprays sideways rather than forwards. And so all I needed to do was to find a matching can that was capable of taking the same cap, and I could then spray paint out of it. I basically turned this into a Fast and the Furious inspired nitrous paint fogger. And I wanted to use paint for a couple of reasons. I will go back and I'll actually put cavity wax down that cavity, but I wanted that to sit on top of a layer which is a little bit more hardy. Now in the montage, you could have actually seen the rust converter just dripping through the sills, and that was actually coming out in between spot welds. And then after that, I waxed and grease removed the whole thing. I gave it a little quick scuff up where I could, and then just layered paint into it. And it did take a lot of coats. Obviously spray paint's quite thin. It's not like like the cavity wax would be thick and sticky. Paint's designed to go on and be flat, so it is quite thin. Took probably 4 or 5 coats in that thing, but by the end of it, you could actually see paint dripping out of those seams as well. So not only have we got rust converter all the way through those pinched and welded seams, but now we also have paint going through and sealing it up even further. I mean, the sill is very tight. It didn't give the spray a lot of room to expand, so it was very pinpoint, and what I had to do was basically rotate the shaft as I was moving it in and out of the sill. That's not always a bad thing though. And we do now have really good cover. You can basically see here, the inside of the sill is a beautiful satin black now. Not that the color matters too much, but the important thing is it's protected. And then when we throw the cavity wax over the top of it again, it'll be even further protected for years to come. So that has to be one of the best protected RA23 sills around. And it's part of the reason I didn't want to pull it off as well, because I can do all of that with the sill on and I don't end up compromising it by putting a line all the way through the top of weld and then obviously having to re-weld all of the base plate. So it's looking really good and we are almost ready to go with reassembly. There's just 2 more spots that I need to deal with. So let's jump over to the car. So this is the first bit here. This sheet metal just is a little bit too holy for my liking. So we're just gonna cut a small patch out there and repair that. And then the second one is over here. And so this whole section here is rusted out. Now I haven't gone over this too heavily with a wire brush, so I think the internal piece here, a lot of it will be savable, but I didn't want to compromise it too much before what I'm going to do. Now obviously I've got to do this on the other side of the car, and I figured it would be really boring for you guys to watch this get fixed and then the same thing on the other side. So what I figured is we can try 3 different methods here, and then you guys can get a taste for each one and figure out what you'd be comfortable doing on your own car. So the first method we've sort of covered before, and as you can see, I've already put a cut mark down here to take away this rough metal. And then I've also made up a cardboard template, which matches all the way through. And then from that template, I cut out a piece of metal, which will follow that line all the way through as well. So what I'm gonna do is trim the supporting metal away inside here, and hopefully this will be relatively clean and easy to weld to. If it's not, I'm gonna leave it for now, and I'll come back to it after I finish the work here. So I'll weld this in, just tacking it in, just to keep it in place and get the shape right. And then what I'll do is bend another piece of steel up that matches the curve that I need through here, and I'll tack that on as well, because this is a curve in and of itself, as you can see there, to fit that profile. And then obviously we have another profile here. So it's hard to sort of just beat a piece of metal into that shape, and it needs to sit nicely inside here so that it doesn't get water ingress and stuff like that. So I want to make sure I get this right. So I'll tack this in, and then I'll put probably a larger number of tacks on this piece, And then if it's easy to do, I'll keep welding it in place. If not, I'll bench weld it. And then once we've got a solid right angle piece to go in here that's got all the curves that we need, then I'll finish weld it all in. And if any of these bits start to blow through as I'm finish welding this in, I can just leave them, finish the whole thing, and then come back, cut out a small piece and just replace that small piece. I don't want to start trying to fashion this as well because the majority of this metal is actually all good. So as far as I'm concerned, that's a good solution here. You know, it gets fresh sheet metal welded in. There should be no future issues with rust. It's just not as neat and tidy. And then we can one up and go for a better solution. And that's what I'm going to try on the outside here, which will be to put a piece of metal in that's shaped like this and tails out. And then we're going to try and pie cut it, bend it in on the angles that we need, and then tidy the pie cuts up and then weld the pie cuts together. Right, so it should all be one piece of metal. There won't be a seam along here that, I mean, the potential is that the weld across this seam could crack as we go through here and then the two pieces of metal would separate. You would hope that my welding is at least passable enough now for that not to happen, but who knows. So we'll try the pie cuts. We'll see whether it's actually better or whether it results in a worse outcome, but it's something to try. And then for the other side of the car, we're actually gonna buy a shrinker stretcher setup. So that we can shrink and stretch metal to try and get these curves correct without needing to make them in two pieces. Just be a single piece of metal that has been folded into a right angle and then shrunk or stretched in the right areas to get the curve that we need. And that's really the ideal situation here, where we're not doing a whole bunch of welding and grinding that we don't need to do. We just fashion a piece of metal that's gonna fit. So I'm really interested to see how that goes. Now, that won't all be in this episode. We're not gonna have time to go through all of that because we've got to finish the rest of this panel. We'll at least get this section done for now. For the sake of expediency, I'm gonna do all of this in time lapse, and then we'll come back and start the reassembly. All right, we're done. This area here has a really good shape. I'm really happy with it. This metal was better than I expected, so it didn't have too many problems there. I came down and blended it in here with a few other little pieces and obviously built out the inner flange, if you will, whatever you want to call it, all the way up. So that's all done. And I also touched up this piece here. So basically that was the last of the prep. So we can now start reassembly, and hopefully this goes pretty quick. First thing I'm gonna have to do is get this brace welded in permanently, and then this whole area will need to be final painted. Obviously making sure that the copper primer is still visible where the spot welds need to go, but everything else I want more protected than just this primer. Not that this is bad, but hey, it's open, I might as well. It takes 5 minutes to spray. And then we'll tack in this middle layer, just with a couple of tacks at the moment, to see how it fits with the outer layer over the top, because if we've done anything wrong here, we don't want to end up having to push this outer layer out to make up for it. So once I've confirmed the outer layer fits, we'll pull the outer layer back off, we'll finish weld all of this, and then again, we will paint and prep this area. And then we'll move on to this area here. We've got that small piece that needs to still be put in, and I may actually need to put in some little tabs on the middle layer here to tie into it. And then once that's finished welded in, again, prime, paint, make sure everything's sweet, and then we'll get this outer layer on and we should be pretty much done. Okay, so we got the center skin in here, and I also tacked on this end piece of rail, and I had to fabricate a little tab to go underneath to join these two. So I think originally the bracket that was here probably had some metal and it sort of moved its way through the panel. I just wanted to tie these two together so they're a little bit stronger. Obviously the outside skin will connect into this edge. This is not what I'm looking to connect into. So I'm just gonna drill some holes in here above the tab, spot weld it through, should be fine. Other than that, this is basically at level. There's no difference there, so I'm not going to end up with a real problem. When you're working with these kinds of panels, you've got to make sure that the height between the two is even. Otherwise, you end up with a step that you're going to have to fill on one side or the other with body filler or whatever. I mean, this will need a skim of body filler over the join, because when I grind it down, it's not going to be perfectly flat. But ideally, we want it to be very minimal through here, like less than 1 millimeter. Now all of this is still only tacked in. The reason being is I haven't tried to test fit this outer skin. So let's grab that. All right, and that skin is looking pretty sketchy at the moment, if I'm honest. Basically what I've done is just tacked this piece of metal onto it so that I can get it in place and situate it where the rest of the original panel should be. So if we look on the back, if you see how there's no connection point between the upper and lower other than this end. So it's connected there so we can be sure the vertical height is correct. But on this end, there's nothing there to say that we've got everything in the right position from that corner there to this corner here. So what I'm going to do is get it in place and situated where I want it to be. Make sure that it is true and in line with the rest of the rail. I'll do that with basically a long straight edge. And once I'm convinced I've got the original parts of the panel where it needs to be, I'll then do the final trim out of this makeshift panel, spot weld it in, and then I'll have a reasonable base to take back over to the bench and fill up all the rest of the holes that need to be filled. And if I can get this to the point where I'm happy with it, and that should be sort of somewhere close to where it is, then it will be okay to go back and do all the welding of that piece and this piece on the underside to make sure that it's all 100% welded up. And then we will coat this as well so that we avoid getting rust on the outer shell. All right, so in terms of getting this where I want it to be, I've got to work off my known points of reference, which are good. And the best point of reference that I have is this corner here. There's enough structure in there to know that this won't have moved around much, and I haven't modified it in any way. You can actually see we have a spot weld here that we can work from. So that gives us a really accurate representation of where this should sit. Coming out here, however, this is not a good point of reference because there's simply too much movement in the panel. So the next best point of reference I have is actually the edge of this panel. Now that could be out by a fraction of a millimeter because I have cut it off and re-weld it on and I won't have got it exactly right, but this is pretty close. And then from there, I can follow it all the way down through this edge. And then once I've got this edge tacked together and I'm comfortable with it, I can put the straight edge all the way along here and try and get this back into alignment, tack it on there, and then realistically, hopefully, there's enough structure here to keep me in the right spot up in this end here. And this is why I am not just trying to, well, apart from my fabrication skills are not that crash hot, but this is why I'm trying to retain so much of this original sheet metal and while I'm working with it while it's still on the car. Because that spot weld, I forgot to grind that back. So All right, so we've got paint on the back of this. It's nice and protected. Copper where it needs to be, obviously, for the spot welds and the butt weld at the top. And then on the other side, it looks quasi panel shaped. All right, now I don't know how well that's going to come across in the light. The basic shape is pretty good. There's going to have to be a little bit of panel beating once it's attached to the car. There's no point trying to get it perfectly straight before I weld it on because the chances of it moving around as I do that are high. So that's pretty much ready to go on the car. And if we look at what it's covering up, this is all looking really good. So 99.9% of it is covered in the black ceramic paint. There is the whole pinch weld at the bottom that's still in the copper primer, as is the lip on the wheel arch. So now we have to get the plate tacked in and see where we're at. Once again, we're going to start with the most reliable corner. All right, and we are all tacked in. We have a good line here. We have a good line there. It's not tacked, but it's still good. All of this is very smooth all the way along. And the bottom is fitting up better than I expected, to be honest. This is actually looking really good. So we haven't got this bit here. And like I said, I wasn't doing that today. But this is where I'm going to leave it for two reasons. Firstly, it's about 10:30 on Saturday night, and if I turn on more power tools, my neighbours are going to hunt me down. But also, with this tacked in, I know where I'm at, but I'm concerned if anything happens in here and I've already welded all this in, I am shit out of luck. So I'm going to take my own advice, which I've given many times in here, leave it tacked. We'll sort this out and then we'll finish weld the whole lot all together. So let's jump back to the workbench and talk about some lessons learned. All right, so the panel is in and I think it looks pretty good. There's definitely some things that I would tweak on that top layer, and I may well just unzip those spot welds and move it around when I put in that other panel. But I think the thing to remember is that we have stripped that down to basically nothing and rebuilt it out from scratch and made sure that it's all primed, painted and protected for years to come. And that's the main thing. The top layer, I can do a little bit of panel beating and, like I said, a little skim of bog, and it's probably going to be okay. I don't have the skills to get it back to something that's just going to be file finished and then primed, and that is very much a lost art, and I have nothing but respect for the guys that can actually do that kind of work. But I'm not there yet, I'm still working my way up. Now, if you're gonna take on a repair like that, there is a couple of things I would suggest. And the main one is that I think I've gone about this wrong. What I should have done is repaired the outer skin as the very first thing that I did. So basically, before I cut that giant piece out of the car, I should have cut out smaller sections and just welded pieces of metal in until I could be really confident that I had enough material there to hold together once I'd cut it off the car. Because basically there was so much metal gone, the second I cut it off the car, pieces separated, and it was really quite difficult to get them back into the positions that they should be. And even now, they may not be 100%. And it's now 11 o'clock at night, so I'm gonna get fresh eyes on it in the morning, and if I have to retweak any bits, I will. The layers underneath, I wouldn't worry about too much because the bottom line is you never see them, so you just have to make sure they're structurally sound and protected, which is what I did. So yeah, I think it's pretty good. I would say maybe a 6 out of 10 on the outer skin, but an 8 out of 10 for everything below it. But that's just me, so let me know in the comments whether you think that's a repair that you'd consider acceptable if it was your own car. Go on, you can do it right now. You don't have to wait for the video to end. And while you're doing that, I can tell you some of the other things that I wanted to raise. And the first one is that that black caliper paint will catch on fire if you get it hot enough. Now, it tends to just lighten a small area and not cause too many problems, but it's worth warning you that if you are doing repairs like this, you always want to be able to see the back of the weld, and I would recommend having some sort of fire extinguisher handy so that if things do get out of hand, you can put it out before it takes the car. And the second thing is, if you're having trouble getting your small repair patches to line up perfectly, always err on the side of having that patch lower. Because if it's lower, you can fill it with some body filler and move on with your life. A half a mil or a quarter of a mil here or there is really not going to be noticed. But if they sit proud of your finished surface, they're much harder to repair and you end up trying to blend it in with body filler and it's just a pain and not good for anyone. And then finally, when you are making patch panels or big repair panels, they ideally should fit without any pressure being put on them. Now I cheated a little bit and I'll fully admit that. Some of those areas I basically tacked in a couple of corners and then I just put pressure on something until it was in line and tacked it in. Now sometimes you can get away with it and sometimes it'll bite you because you'll put pressure on, say, a join between two panels, you'll push them together and then zip them up, but what will happen is they'll just pop back out with a bit of tension on the panel and then you'll end up with a hump instead of a smooth curve. And I had to be really careful of that when I was doing that top join on the panel where it meets the rest of it, because it'd be very easy to end up with a hump there and then you're going to ruin that really smooth contour that sort of defines that back end. So yeah, they're my tips. And as I said, I have not had a lot of experience doing repairs that big. This was certainly a big learning curve for me and I'm going to get more tools and continue that learning curve and hopefully things will just get better and better as the build progresses. I'm really interested to see what we can do with that shrinker stretcher, and I've also bought a little set of mini bending brake jaws for the vise here. So all of that will come out on the next Violet Crumbles episode. But next week we've got something a little different planned. We've got a new car for the channel which is in a bad state of repair and needs a bit of love. So we're going to get stuck into that and look at some of the more common problems for newer cars. So stick around for that one and don't forget to like this episode and subscribe if you haven't. And as usual, if you're new to the channel, you should watch the whole Violet Crumbles series, which I'll link to here, and check out the A90 episodes, which I'll link to here. Other than that, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time on The Build Room. Bye for now.